Yeah, I think people today sometimes do find it difficult to imagine that the content of the Bible, the creation stories and so forth are helpful to science. But what I think is missed in this is a realization that underlying our whole approach to natural science, which today we take for granted, are a set of philosophical presuppositions that needed to be arrived at, which weren't automatic. And so one can think about questions like, the Bible teaches that the creation is separate from God. That's an important aspect. If you have a pantheist view that gods are everywhere in nature, then the way you approach nature is with a great reservation, because you might be interfering with the divine. But from a biblical point of view, if creation is separate from God, then we can study it without fear of violating the divine. The Bible says that the creation was good, and that makes us have a view that it's worthy of study on its own grounds. The Bible teaches that it's the contingent creation of God. So it's not possible for us to discover the way the world is by simply sitting in our armchairs and trying to think about it. We've actually got to go out and do experiments, find out what it's really like. So that's the incentive to experiment, which is such a vital part of science. And in the end, I think these types of philosophical and theological views were part of that hospitable climate that existed within the biblical worldview. And that ultimately then answers the question that has been put by many people over history, not least Alfred North Whitehead and others. Why is it that modern science grew up in the West, the Christian West in a certain sense, where it didn't grow up in other societies, many of which had just as great technology, were just as rich, had just as well-developed cultures? And I think that the suggestion is, I won't make it more than a suggestion, I don't claim it's a proof, but the suggestion is that actually, contrary to what is often the caricature we're offered today, which is that science and Christian theology are always and have always been at loggerheads, in fact, Christian theology served as a kind of hospitable or fruitful culture in which science as we know it today could grow. Now, of course, we take it for granted, many of those philosophical underpinnings of science today, but nevertheless, they weren't self-evident once upon a time. So can we just proceed now, given that we have these philosophical underpinnings, and put aside, our youth, which once we believed in Christianity or gods, but now we no longer need that for science? I mean, I think there is a sense in which science can proceed without religion. There is a sense in which it can take place. But one question you could ask is whether it in fact does proceed without religion. It's commonly portrayed these days as if there's some kind of exclusive choice between I'm going to believe in science or going to trust science, or I'm going to believe in religion. And many young people gain from their education the impression that it's the choice is as stark as that. That is in fact not reflected by the reality. If you go to any university and ask the question, who are the Christians that in that university? Well, in the first place, it's true that there'll probably be a lower percentage of Christians among, let us say, the faculty of that university than there are in the society as a whole, certainly in America. That's true. But if you ask a more focused question, which is, if I compare the people in the sciences with those in the humanities and social studies, what you find is that actually far from the scientists and engineers being the people who most reject Christianity and religious beliefs, in fact, they are the people who most adopt religious beliefs. And so it's quite contrary to the caricature that we're often offered, which is, science or religion. That's not reflected in the reality of the modern academy and of modern society as a whole. So I would say, just from an experimental, in a certain sense, point of view, it doesn't seem to me that stark choice of God or science is actually reflected in what people actually believe. I don't know whether, in fact, one should make too much of that, but at the very least, it calls in question, I would say, the myth that science and religion are and always have been and always will be at war.